How often have you felt restricted to spiritual practices that often seem outdated and of little relevance in today's world? Are you discouraged to express your own creative talents and develop spiritual practices that are uniquely you? The Liturgical Rebels podcast is for people like you who want to reimagine and reconstruct their faith and spiritual practices. It's for those who want to reshape belief and journey closer to God's wholeness with peace, justice, and flourishing, not just for themselves, but for the earth and all its inhabitants. In today's episode of Liturgical Rebels, I will co-host, together with Forrest Inslee, the host of Earthkeepers podcast, a conversation with Brian McLaren, author, speaker, and activist. We will talk about his new book, Life After Doom, Wisdom and Courage for a World Falling Apart, and about its profound implications for how we live and love in the face of the extreme environmental and social changes facing our planet. I've known Brian for many years and am impressed with his growing passion for environmental justice and his call to all of us to become more radically involved in the fight against climate change.
Well, Christine, my friend, it is always good to be co-hosting again with you. Wondered if you could give a little background to our guest today.
Yes, it's a delight for me to be joining Forrest and my good friend Brian McLaren. Brian is an author, speaker, activist, and public theologian. He's been a prolific writer over the years, and his most recent book, just coming out, is Life After Doom, Wisdom and Courage for a World Falling Apart. And it's that book that we're really going to focus on this morning.
Yeah, so welcome, Brian. We're glad to have you.
Thanks. So glad to be with you. And Christine, I just need to say, I have learned so much from you over the years. So I really am honored to be with you.
Well, thank you very much. I've certainly learned a lot from you too, and particularly as I've read through this latest book. So I'm so glad we get an opportunity to talk about it and to even reflect a little bit on our history together.
Actually, Brian, that's one of the reasons I really wanted to do this interview with Christine, because I've heard that you have this history together, and Christine and her husband, Tom, have had a formative influence on me, and I understand that was true of you too. Maybe the two of you could flesh out that story. How do your stories intersect?
Well, I'll be glad to get started on that, Christine, by just telling a story. You know, I read Mustard Seed Conspiracy and so many other great books. I think Tom was the first person I'd ever encountered with the word futurist associated in his name, and that became a huge interest of mine. But an experience that immediately springs to the top of my list of good experiences with the signs is that we were in a little town in Alberta, Canada. I forgot the name of the town, but you were speaking, and of the many good things that were shared, you guided us in a reading of the prophets. And I had such a constricted teaching about what the prophets were about. I saw them only as people whose job was to make predictions that Jesus would fulfill that would prove us as the people having the right religion. And you were showing the prophets as people with imagination for a better world. And that session changed me in deep ways. And it's not an exaggeration to say every time I engage with the Hebrew prophets in the Bible, I'm still reaping benefits from that experience.
Oh, that's lovely to hear. Well, the prophets, particularly Isaiah, which is where we would have been quoting from, has been very formative for me too, going back to my time with mercy ships on board the Anastasis, and just such an image of hope that you see, and hope deferred in so many ways, and yet creating a vision that is so important. And I remember that. And then the other time I remember was probably 20, 25 years ago now, was you coming to our place here, and Karen Ward was here as well. I don't remember who else was here, and having dinner. And what a lovely time that was as well, to get a chance to get together with you in that kind of more intimate fellowship way.
And we ate some food from your garden, some tomatoes and other vegetables from your garden. So I remember that day.
That would be true. And I'm just getting ready to plant tomatoes now. So wonderful memories to have.
So, Brian, you've written a book called Life After Doom, Wisdom and Courage for a World Falling Apart. And my first question is, does anyone invite you to parties anymore?
Oh, my goodness. That's right. I wanted to have a title that would be accurate and that would challenge people and get people's attention. But I did wonder how it would affect my social life. Yeah.
Well, I have to say that the influence of the prophets is really clear in this book. And one of the things you do is you speak hard truth and you speak possible futures. And I think this book is just very powerful. We recommend it to everyone who's listening.
Yes, I agree.
Well, I do have a question about your writing process. And when you were writing this book, who did you have in mind? Who is this book for, essentially?
So a bit of backstory. I wrote a book back in 2006, 2007 that was called Everything Must Change. And it was my attempt at answering a question for myself. And that question was, what are the biggest problems in the world? Obviously, there are a lot of problems, but how do we trace sort of surface problems down to root problems? And that experience really changed my life. And in many ways, Life After Doom is a sequel to that book, or it's myself continuing that journey 15 plus years later. The thing that has happened, I think, in recent years is that more and more people have gotten realistic about how serious our current situation is. The way we're living with the earth, the way a tiny, rich minority of super billionaires have amassed not only wealth, but also power. They do things like buy social media and mass media outlets so that they can then influence public opinion. And they give huge amounts of money to politicians who will do their bidding. So these problems that I addressed in that earlier book have only intensified and postponed action on many really, really important issues, especially relating to how we live with the earth. So I knew that my anxiety levels were growing and that I felt I was keeping at bay the worst of the information. And at some point I felt it takes more energy to keep that information at bay than it would take to just face it. So I wanted to face it. Plus, I knew that many of my close friends were really struggling with despondency and wondering whether it was worth even staying in the struggle. So that was the occasion. Those are the people I was writing for.
Well, I must confess that as I read the first chapter, I really did wonder if there was life after doom, because it was pretty daunting. But then in chapter 2, you say there is life after doom. But to get there, first you have to face the doom. Would you unpack that a little bit more? Firstly, what do you mean by doom? And what does it mean to face it?
So when some people hear doom, they think what that means is absolute hopelessness, so that we ought to just give up because there's no hope. The way I'm defining doom is a psychological experience, a very intense psychological experience that I think it's safe to say that millions, maybe hundreds of millions, and I would suspect soon it will be billions of people on earth are facing. It's the feeling that we get when the institutions that we trust do not seem capable of dealing with the dangers that we face. We have institutions we trust to take care of things. And when they're failing us, when the problems have gotten too complicated or they've become too decadent or complacent or whatever, we go through this feeling, oh no, things are not looking like they're going to work out well. And when that happens, it puts enough stress on us that a whole bunch of things can result. Some of them could make our situation worse and some could make them better. And so that's why I think we have to face the doom so that then we can summon the wisdom and courage to do what needs to be done.
And so what does a post-doom world look like for you?
Yeah, let me first say one of the contributions I hope the book makes is that I create 4 scenarios to help people understand 4 possible futures. I do not know which of those 4 futures is likely. I think we have something to say in which of those 4 will come to pass. None of us have the final word, though. Enough people could do the wrong thing that could send us to worse outcomes. Enough people could do the right thing that would send us to more desirable outcomes. But I think what happens is when we learn to face doom, we start to understand that one of those outcomes is going to happen, one or more, because we could have one and then that could lead to another. But it gives us a sense of what realistically is ahead. I think that then motivates us to try to take wise and appropriate and urgent action. And when we take that kind of action, we move the needle a little bit toward the more hopeful scenarios. And if enough other people do the same, then that momentum multiplies.
In your book, you do speak a lot of hard truths. And early in the book, you address your readers directly and say, take what you can, do as much as you're able. That might mean not reading certain chapters. That might mean reading slowly, setting the book aside, maybe even reading with other people, which I think is actually a great idea for this book in particular.
One of the things I'm aware of is, look, everybody is dealing with their own personal stuff. I just got a call from a close friend the other day who just got a really terrible diagnosis, medical diagnosis. And look, he doesn't have time to be worrying about climate change and concentration of wealth and power among billionaires. He's got to deal with survival right now. And I've got other friends who have huge problems with their children, and we're all dealing with our own personal challenges. But I think there are growing numbers of us who know that business as usual is not going to turn out well. And so they're the ones who I think are ready to say, okay, let's try to face this as grown-ups. I've had a couple of big health challenges in my life, and I didn't want the doctor to sugarcoat things for me. I wanted to get the clearest sense I could of what it would mean. And, one of the things that's been interesting for me in the writing of the book is that I found a kind of a relief and joy from trying to face the worst. I think there's a natural joy that comes in trying to recognize and tell the truth. And I think there's a kind of relief that comes when we stop wasting energy in denial. So I hope other people will experience that in the process of reading.
It makes me think of if you get a splinter in your finger and it's going to be painful to get it out, but then the relief when you've actually gotten it out, it's worth it. And I think in some ways it's a very small example of the kind of relief that we can get when we get it out into the open and expose what needs to be exposed, and then start thinking seriously about not only what we can do, but about what others can do as well to make a difference. And one of the terms you use in the book is ecological overshoot. What does that mean, and how is it at the heart of the progression out of doom?
I'm so glad you bring that up, Christine, because it's a concept if people aren't familiar with it. It will change your life. It will change how you understand the world. Simple way to say it is this. If we human beings all together as a civilization, as a species interacting with each other and with the planet, if we suck out more resources than the earth can replenish, and we pump out more wastes than the earth can detoxify, then we are destroying our own life support system. And the more of us there are, and the more affluent we are, the more quickly the damage will accrue. So if we can just understand the deeper problem is overshoot. It's one of the reasons why I don't think our primary problem is simply climate change. Climate change is a symptom of overshoot. And it's a particularly sad symptom because it results from us doing something for a long time that we didn't know what we were doing. It evokes, Father, forgive them, they don't know what they do. We didn't know what we were doing. There were people trying to tell us. A lot of people don't know this, but a couple of scientists in Europe before the American Civil War, understood what we call climate change today. They understood the properties of carbon in the atmosphere and how that created something we now call the greenhouse effect. They understood this. They made incredibly accurate predictions of what would happen. And so this was out there, but people didn't want to face it. And then when people started facing it, other people, this is despicable, it's horrible, and it's a fact. They started spreading disinformation on purpose so they could keep making money. So overshoot is the deeper issue. And if we want to deal with the disease and not just the symptom, then that creates a vision for us. And here's the vision. It's actually the vision that you see in the first chapters of Genesis, and that you see in some ways reprised in the last chapters of Revelation. It's people living with the earth, taking care of it, not sucking out more than it can replenish, and not pumping out more waste than it can detoxify. If we learn to live that way, we'd have such a bright future.
Well, I think it's an aside, but one of the things I've learnt from the garden is that in God's economy, there is a net gain and not a net drain. You work in the garden, you take all of this amazing produce out of it, and you end up with a pile of compost in the end that then adds to the garden. It doesn't take from, I think God's first act after creation was to create a garden. And I think that tells us something about the character of God and God's intention, I think, for this earth too.
That tells us something. In fact, I had this kind of epiphany in writing the book because my own curiosity led me to go deeper and deeper in trying to understand human civilization as an energy project, a project of finding more and better ways to accumulate energy in the forms of food or money or fossil fuels or whatever it is. And that made me think about life in a different way. And one way to describe life is a process of using energy to create more energy. And when you think of what happens in the processes of life, we create more and more complex forms of life, more and more diverse and beautiful forms of life. They all depend on energy, but they take in energy and create something more complex, more diverse, more beautiful, more conscious. It makes me just be in awe of the miracle of life. And if we could fall in love with that miracle again, I think it would help us be better human beings. And every season when you garden is one way that you fall in love with that mystery again.
Yes, definitely.
One of the things I think that was different about this book was your point that this is not just about climate changes, but instead the unfolding climate crisis is a symptom, and that it's very possible, even probable, that the collapse of civilization as we know it is coming as well. Can you talk about that interplay, the interaction between the ecological crisis and maybe a social crisis?
So this is something a lot of people haven't thought about, but if folks dared to dip their toe into the literature, they would find this very quickly. First, I should say, there are people who are doing essential work in a very specialized area. There are people who spend their whole lives studying the effect of one type of fungi on a rainforest health, right? That's important work. Other people who spend their whole lives studying one ice sheet on southwestern Antarctica. And that very specific, detailed, deep work is important. There are other people who start looking at the big picture across ecology, and then other people who start looking at the interface between human civilization, human economies, human politics, and the environment. And what people who study this know is that before the environment collapses, before there's ecological collapse, our civilization will collapse because our civilization depends upon a healthy environment. And in fact, because there are so many of us and we're making such huge demands on the earth, we are already feeling the effects of centuries of accumulated harm in the environment. Let me just give a quick example. When people started drilling for oil in the early 20th century, oil was right underneath the surface. So you would get a phenomenal return on investment. I'm just making up these numbers, but you might spend $100 to dig a well and you'd make $1 million in return on investment. But what's happened is we got all the easy oil. And now we have to go deeper and deeper for oil. And we have to go deeper in more and more difficult places to get the oil. And already, a lot of people don't know this, but the energy return on investment, you have to spend so much energy to get that energy out that our economy will eventually reach the point where fossil fuels are just a bad deal anyway. Now, thankfully, already solar and wind energy are more economical to produce in many ways than energy from fossil fuels. But if we don't make the proper adjustments in time, our civilization is fragile enough that the fear that many of us have is that our civilization, in its collapse, will, instead of bringing out the best in us, will bring out the worst in us. And if I can give one example, over the last 20 years, there's been a lot of unrest in Syria. A lot of people don't know that climate change actually has had a role to play in what's going on in Syria. A lot of people don't know that the horrible genocide of 1994 in Rwanda was related to a very serious drought and famine. So when the Syrian civil war broke out, about 1 million refugees were unleashed on the world, especially Europe. And what happened from those 1 million refugees is they had to find a place to live. And it stirred up both great hospitality and generosity of people welcoming Syrian refugees. And then it turned up a vicious, racist, Islamophobic backlash against Syrian refugees. The same event evoked mercy from some people and fury from other people, right? So when we imagine intensifying environmental instability, that will produce economic consequences, that will produce consequences in terms of refugees and poverty and so on. And that will create other kinds of social problems. And that's why I think many people just think, well, it's not too bad yet. We don't need to worry about it. No, we need to understand we have to do the work to prepare ourselves for the consequences that are already baked in and that are somewhat inevitable. We've got a lot of work to do.
Brian, when Tom and I met you 25 years ago or more, you were neither a contemplative nor an environmental advocate. And we're not going to go back there. But since then, we've really watched your life journey with interest and seen your faith evolve and changing the focus of what you're concerned about. And in Life After Doom, you talk about how important contemplation has become in helping you to move forward as you struggle with issues of climate change and the doom that hangs over us. I was very interested in this because I discovered contemplation when I worked in the refugee camps on the Thai-Cambodian border in the 1980s and looking for something that could really help, in a way, lift one out of that heavy weight of doom and such. So can you explain what contemplation looks like for you and how it's helped you to move forward?
So, as you know, Christine, a lot of my life has been an argument with a certain kind of rigid, strict, combative Christianity that I had inherited and I saw growing among so many of my fellow Christians. And through the years, my whole spiritual journey, I was on my way out of Christianity as a teenager because it just wasn't going to work for me. And what kept me in was a very powerful kind of mystical experience that I had as a teenager. So that root had always been there for me. I don't know, it was probably around 2001, 2002, I had gotten to know the Franciscan friar, Richard Rohr. And Richard and I had spoken together and become friends. And I remember one night we were having dinner in a little Mexican restaurant. And we would just, whenever we would speak at the same event, we would get together and catch up. And he said, yeah, Brian, he said, I'm more and more feeling that you and I are spending a huge amount of energy trying to help people change their understandings of Christianity. But he said, I don't think they can accept these new understandings until they have a change in their way of thinking. They can't accept new thoughts until they learn a new way of thinking. And that was the genesis where he was beginning to write some books like Falling Upward that would lead in that direction. And I remember thinking, that's it. You're so right. And really, it was largely through Richard. Richard had started using the term alternative orthodoxy. And what he meant by that was this Minority Report and the Christian faith. It's like this different brand of Christianity that wasn't a different denomination. It existed in many denominations. And it wasn't arguing with traditional orthodoxy. It was in some ways ignoring traditional orthodoxy, saying, we don't even want to get in arguments with you. We just want to focus on other things. And one of those other things is to focus on the curation of our inner life, not just trying to jam a bunch of beliefs and doctrines and theology in our head, but to actually help us learn how to be open to reality and open to God and open to nature and open to one another in deeper and deeper ways. So that set of practices was like, well, literally a godsend for me, as I imagine it was for you too.
Yep, very much so.
Well, that's such an important point you're making about contemplation, that it has to do with a mindset shift or a heart set shift, change even of worldview. You don't, I think, as some books on climate change, et cetera, do, is call people to action. It's all about changing this, doing that, living differently. Your call really is about being differently. It's more about inner transformation so that your actions in the coming crisis or the present crisis flow out of that place of inner change, inner transformation. Is that a good read?
Yeah, I'm glad that was the impression you got, Forrest, because first of all, I think we modern people who don't understand the degree to which we have been discipled by fossil fuels. We have been discipled to think that every problem can be quickly solved with money and some fossil fuels, right? We don't even know how ubiquitous fossil fuels are in our agriculture, in our politics, in our IRA accounts, everything. It's everywhere. So we assume that every problem can be solved quickly and easily with technology, with political decisions, so on. I hope I'm wrong, but I don't think we have the skill and capacity and maturity to solve this quickly. So I think this is going to be a difficult and tough transition. And I hate to say it, but we modern humans are a little bit like rich kids. I mean, obviously there's some very poor people, but those of us with cell phones and part of this sort of global economy and so on, we have been spoiled to think that every problem can be solved quickly. We don't know how to live with unknowing and uncertainty. I think we're facing some unknowing and uncertainty. So that's why we need wisdom. And we don't know how to live with problems that our existing institutions are incapable of solving. That's going to take courage. And overall, it's going to take love for us to bring our best selves and come together rather than tearing apart and turning on each other. So that's why the being side of this seems especially important. I'm all for action. I've been arrested. I participate in protests. I'm for all of that. I really am. I wouldn't be surprised if in the coming years, many of us will be involved in levels of civil and civic action that we never imagined before. But to be sustained, Christine, as you said, to be sustained in a refugee camp, seeing huge amounts of human suffering, we need the skills of resilience and the practices of inner curation to keep working from a center of love as opposed to just anger or revenge or fury.
Brian, I think your comments about inner change, inner transformation, resilience, what you're really talking about is what ought to be the purview of the church in influencing people's lives, right? This is the job of the church, is to help people become the kind of people who can not just survive, but to thrive in difficult situations and to help others to do the same. I would say that all your writing reflects this tension between a real deep love for the church, but also an honest critique of the church as well. And in this book, you write in chapter 5, and here's what is striking about the theological narrative I and billions of Christians have inherited. It is both socially disengaged and anti-ecological. So those are pretty tough words, but maybe you can expand on that. How is the church, in your view, complicit in our present and future crisis? And maybe even what are the possibilities that the church might be guided by a different story.
Well, Forrest, it is a rather harsh indictment, but unfortunately, I think, if anything, I understated it there. And this has nothing to do with any individual's malice or willful ignorance. Most of us as Christians, we just believe what we were told. We believe what people we trusted told us. And then we might say, well, no, I read it in the Bible. Yeah, but we were taught which verses in the Bible to emphasize and which ones didn't apply. And we were taught all kinds of assumptions about how to read the Bible, how to pick a verse out of context and apply it to something it never related to. We were taught all these techniques. So what ended up happening, I hate to say it, but we ended up with a form of Christianity that was perfectly designed to help white European Christians go around the world and oppress people around the world, exploit them because we were God's elect and they were not, and try to convert them, and whether they converted or not, to put them in a position of subordination. We called it empire. And there was a Spanish version of it that was predominantly Catholic. And there was an English version of it that was predominantly Protestant. And there were Dutch and Portuguese and Italian versions, many other versions of it. Not only did it give us permission to exploit other people by giving us this sense that we were the elect or the chosen, a gross misunderstanding of what being chosen means in the Bible, by the way, but it also gave us permission to exploit the earth, and then gave us an eschatology or view of the future that said, look, God plans to destroy the earth very soon anyway. We might as well return it empty. You put that whole package together, it's perfectly designed to lead to the mess that we're in. So that leads some people to say, yeah, Christianity is evil. Let's get rid of it. It has nothing to offer. The irony is that two of the chapters in the book that I'm most happy about is that I think if we go back, we can reread the Bible as an ecological narrative that we have wickedly misinterpreted to be the very opposite. And that's one of the things I hope people will take away.
I agree wholeheartedly, and have read a number of things recently that have that perspective, both from looking at the Hebrew scriptures and the Bible as a whole. And it's just fascinating to change our perspective. And I think that it's something that fortunately more and more people are talking about, and I think is going to help change our perspective. But I think for me, not surprisingly probably, my favorite chapter was chapter 17, Beauty Abounds, because it so much revolves around my own worldview, which has become a view of looking for the awe and wonder in the world around us. But in this chapter, you remind us that there are two types of stories that matter. The story of humanity's bumpy descent towards collapse, which of course is a lot of what we've been talking about here. But you comment that this is the story that dominates the daily news. And it's true. There is so much that talks about the negative aspects of things which are happening. But there is another story of beauty unfolding in the world. And it seldom appears on the news, but amazing stories of beautiful news appear every day if we only look for them. And I love to look for the good news stories. And I think Forrest and I are both addicted to some of the British garden shows. And I think part of that addiction is because they show some of the good news things that are happening. People creating wildlife gardens and people changing from unsustainable practices to sustainable practices and this kind of thing. And that, I think, is something that really helps us. And gardening and even learning about gardening helps us in this way. So what kind of an impact does this kind of a perspective have practically on your life? I know you keep turtles, and I'm sure that's part of it.
Oh my, yes. In fact, I could look out my window right now. I don't see any right now, but I have some tortoises that wander around my backyard. And I live in Southwest Florida. When I woke up this morning, I woke up to the sound of tree frogs croaking because it was kind of humid. And I'm a bird lover. And this time of year where I live, it's hard to have a favorite bird, but one of my favorite birds is called the swallow-tailed kite. And every time I see one, it takes my breath away and just fills me with awe and wonder, just as you say, and as you've written about so beautifully, Christine. So I think this is super important for many reasons. One, it helps us not be overwhelmed by the ugly news. I mean, look, we could just say, until further notice, assume that today this politician is going to say and do outrageous things. And assume until further notice every day that these corporations are going to do these horrible things. You don't even need to keep up. You can just assume. Someone will tell us if they change. There's a role for keeping surveillance on the damage people are doing and so on. But I think it becomes so easy for us to forget the beauty. I had this experience a couple of days ago. I was getting on an airplane thinking about this, and my seat was in the back of the airplane. And as I was walking down the aisles, I just looked to my left and to my right, and I see this elderly couple. I'm pretty old, but they had me beat by maybe 20 years. And they were sitting next to each other, holding hands. And I just, as I saw them, my eyes got tears in them because I thought, oh, that's so beautiful. And across was a mom getting out coloring books for her kid to keep the kid occupied. I thought, there's love between that mother and that child. I don't know this person's story, but who knows? They might be getting on this plane to go care for a loved one who's sick. By the time I got to the back of the plane, I just felt like I've been shown the beauty in the faces of these people. So it's in gardens and it's in birds and it's in people we have to remember too.
Yes, definitely.
I think that what you're talking about, this practice of noticing beauty, takes a lot of intention because it's not just bad news. It's all news. It's all of life. It's the busyness of our lifestyles that keep us from truly seeing what's around us. And it's almost like you have to learn a discipline to stop and say, what is around me? What is in my place that speaks of God, that declares the glory of God?
There's an ancient practice really that leads us to do that very thing. And it's the Benedictine practice of looking for consolation and desolation. And there's other versions of it in other monastic traditions as well. But the idea that there are experiences of consolation where that moment where Christine is in her garden and she reaches down and just picks up a little handful of soil and she sees all the little arthropods moving around in it and the earthworms. And she just sees that in a handful of soil is a whole community of creatures who are working in that soil. And the food that we enjoy is in part because of their work. And suddenly feel, not only are there farmers out there helping us, there are billions of insects and arthropods and worms and fungi and all the rest. And you have that moment of just, what a wonderful world.
What you're not talking about, I think, is the kind of hope that a lot of people are advocating for today. Hope that keeps us positive, that keeps us focused on just what is good, ignoring what is bad, not facing the truths of our difficult reality. And throughout the book, really, you kind of problematize this word hope. Maybe you could tell us what, in your view, is the problem with hope. And if it isn't hope that we hold on to, what does sustain us and motivate us in a world falling apart?
I quote the brilliant Baptist theologian Miguel de la Torre, who shared an experience he had when he went to Auschwitz, and he saw a sign over the entrance to Auschwitz where all the Jews and others who were being brought in for a labor camp from which they would never escape. The sign read, "Work will make you free." And Miguel had this realization. Hope can be what oppressors use to trick people into keeping going so they can continue to be oppressed. Because what the Nazis were doing is saying, we promise we'll set you free. Have hope. Just work and it'll all work out. You'll be okay. And of course, it was a lie. So there is a kind of hope that can be used to deceive us. And that in so doing, we become their pawns in our own undoing, right? People lie to us. They make promises to us so that we'll vote for them or so that we'll give them money or whatever. And they're exploiting us and they're using us. They don't care about us. They just care about their money or their votes or their power. So that is a danger of hope. There's also a way we self-deceive with a kind of hope. We don't want to do the hard work of facing our challenges. Look, I got up really early this morning because I called my doctor yesterday. I had melanoma some years ago, so I have to really watch for little lesions on my skin. And I called my doctor. I said, I have an appointment in a month, but I've got this lesion. I wonder if I should come in. She said, meet me at 7:30 tomorrow morning. So she came early. I had an early appointment today. And the reason I did that was because I know my brain tends to say, oh, there's nothing to it. Oh, there's nothing to it. And if I had done that a few years ago with another lesion that I had, when my doctor did the surgery, he said to me, if you had waited 6 more months, you would have a very different future. And so there's a kind of hope that can be self-deceiving too. But I have a friend who's a research psychologist. His whole life's work is studying the positive psychological benefits of a good kind of hope. And that good kind of hope, it seems to me, has to do with the will to live and the will to do good and the will to do what's right. And the person who captured it, I quote him in the book, is the poet, playwright, president, Václav Havel, who said, hope is not the certainty that things will turn out as we wish, but hope is the conviction that some things are worth doing no matter how they turn out. And that sense, what it says to me is, I don't know how things will turn out. I know how I want to show up. And I want to show up as a person with wisdom and courage and love and commitment and the right kind of hope.
So like you, Brian, Forrest and I both believe that we have much to learn from Indigenous peoples. And I think that we would include Celtic peoples in that as well, because they were very much Indigenous peoples. But as Forrest said, you challenged both of us through your reasoning that in many ways, Indigenous people have been looking at the end of the world for a long time, or at least the end of the world as they knew it and the end of the world that they grew up with. So can you fill that out a little bit about what you've learned from Indigenous peoples, and I'm sure are still learning through some of the challenges that these people face?
Well, one of the things I'm sure you've both noticed that is ubiquitous in the literature that's dealing with our current situation is that Westernized, civilized, capitalistic, progress-oriented people like me have been so thoroughly shaped by the assumptions of our current economy and politics and fossil fuels and all the rest, that the way we try to solve problems very often perpetuates the problem we're trying to solve because we carry assumptions that we're not even aware of. And so one of the reasons I think people are saying we've got to pay attention to Indigenous people is because when the colonizers came with that mindset, they said, yeah, we don't want to join this. And they resisted. And for that, many were killed. Many were put into concentration camps. Many were forcibly, their children were taken away to be re-educated and so on. And they were called savages by people who called themselves civilized. And it just looks now like this was just a case of mass delusion on the part of the so-called civilized. And so now we start to realize we need the wisdom that people have who have nearly been wiped out. But thank God they survive and they've carried on their wisdom. One of the things that happened to me in the writing of the book is I realized, well, that describes not only the Celts, as you say, it describes the ancient Hebrew people who were resisting being colonized. I have some rabbi friends, they have a little slogan, resisting tyrants since Pharaoh. And the ancient Hebrew people were people trying to resist that kind of colonization. So I'll just give one example of something recently that just has deeply, deeply touched me. The Haudenosaunee people of the Northeast, especially centered in the Finger Lakes of New York, they have a Thanksgiving protocol or Thanksgiving ritual that they've been using for a very, very long time. And some years ago, they said, we are sharing this with the world. This is a gift from us. You're welcome to use this, whatever your religion, whatever your tradition. We give you permission and our blessing to use this. It's a long Thanksgiving prayer. And of course, it thanks the Great Spirit. It thanks God, the source of all things. But before it thanks God, it thanks the water, and it thanks the birds, and it thanks the trees, and it thanks the grasses. And I just think there's something so healthy about that, because it doesn't bypass our partners in this world. It allows us to stop and say, thank you, water, for all the amazing things you do. Thank you, clouds. Thank you, seasons. And appropriately then, and thank you, Great Spirit, for all of these gifts. Something about that, I just feel I need that, and we all need that.
In this episode of the Liturgical Rebels, Forrest Inslee and I have been in conversation with Brian McLaren, friend, activist, and author. We discussed his new book, Life After Doom, Wisdom and Courage for a World Falling Apart. For more information about Brian and his new book, make sure you visit the show notes associated with this episode. In the next episode, I will be in conversation with Naomi Lawrence, a fibre artist and yarn bomber originally from the UK, but now residing in East Harlem. Naomi delights in bringing light into dark places with her beautiful floral street art that often adorns chain link fences or walls. I am Christine Sine, author of The Gift of Wonder and facilitator of the Godspace Light website. If you enjoyed this episode, don't forget to hit like and subscribe to the podcast, or join me on Substack, Instagram, or Facebook.